and welcome to Proofpoint's live stream. So today's topic is going to be on ransomware. It is one of today's most disruptive form of cyber attacks, and we want to share with you a webinar recording that we did recently with two phenomenal speakers, Ryan Kallenberg, our EVP of Cybersecurity Strategy, and Sherry DeGreppo, our Senior Director for Threat Research and Detection. So in the video, you'll see that Ryan and Sherry talk extensively on why ransomware is a top cybersecurity concern, what trends they're seeing across the globe, and what you can do to stop them from getting into your organization. So we hope you enjoy the video.
Thanks, Monica, and welcome everybody. Great to have you talking about an awful topic today. Sharon, how many times have you had a ransomware-related conversation in the last month?
Multiple times a day, every day, multiple times a day. It is absolutely top of mind for our customers, and it's really top of mind in the media. I've been saying lately, ransomware has hit the mainstream and taken everyone's attention with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is obviously the one relatively common attack type that can affect every type of organization that can actually shut you down. So no need to introduce this topic any further. So let's dive right in. We only have a half hour today. I thought actually one of the things that would be most useful for an audience is to share a bit of data and actually try and put the ransomware epidemic in context. Because in certain ways, ransomware is very complex. We have a complex crimeware ecosystem. We have different players playing different parts. And in some ways, it's actually deceptively simple. Ransomware really only gets into organizations in three primary ways. And for this, actually, we're relying on data from an organization we work with occasionally called Coveware that does a lot of actual ransomware negotiations. Mercifully, we don't have to do that side of the ransomware challenge. But ultimately, one of the things that has really happened over the last couple of years is, and we'll get to the email evolution of ransomware shortly, but there's kind of three ways in. And number one, for most organizations that are relatively small, remains remote desktop protocol, or RDP. If you have any of that protected by a single factor password, just get off this webinar right now and go try and fix it, because ultimately that is going to be the easiest way for an attacker to get in if they don't have to do anything harder than that. Second main category is, of course, email. And when you get to relatively large organizations who do not have single factor RDP facing the internet, this becomes the dominant attack type. Now that varies quarter over quarter. We saw it hit a high of about 90% for enterprise organizations in Q4 of last year, which was an extremely busy ransomware quarter, even if it wasn't quite as busy in the headlines. It is still a majority of enterprise ransomware attacks now, because again, if you don't have the really, really low-hanging fruit of RDP, email is the next best option, and it scales relatively well. Sharon, I think the volumes that we've seen in email have definitely reflected kind of this move away from the easy stuff like RDP toward email to go for bigger, juicier targets.
Absolutely. I watch the email landscape every day. It's one of my main focuses at work. And, we've been talking for years about these modular downloaders, right? They get onto a machine and they're this malicious code that essentially is like a little Swiss Army knife for the threat actors to use in any way that they want. And we have found that the increasing popularity, so the volumes are really, really high of these downloaders, GULoader, ZLoader. And then they've also put these downloader capabilities into your classic banking Trojans like TrickBot, Ursnif, Dridex. So really what we're seeing is this evolution where the threat actors are developing modular pieces of code that give them choice and flexibility, just like real software development.
Exactly. And their choice, because the monetization is so good, has almost exclusively been ransomware lately. The good news is there is, of course, defense in depth for this. If you think about an email threat, obviously there is a way to stop it at the gateway. You can use API-based defenses for cloud office suites. You have awareness training to try and make sure your people do not activate the threat, because virtually 100% of this relies on social engineering and not an actual technical vulnerability. Malicious macros seems to be the absolute dominant form right now. Shared, we have a little bit of data on that later. And then, of course, you can go further in ways that are not traditionally considered an email defense. You can make sure that emailed links open up in isolation as opposed to directly in one's browser, or even, of course, things like EDR, which would try and stop the malware once it got onto the machine via the activation of something like a malicious macro. So there's defense in depth there. That's not the subject of this webinar. Obviously, there's lots of great proof point content out there about that, but again, there is defense in depth for what really matters on the ransomware side of things, except RDP and this last category that I do want to mention briefly, because again, it's sort of a misunderstood part of the landscape. Internet-facing appliances that have actively exploited vulnerabilities. And that is not to say, you have to patch everything 100% of the time, because we know that that's not really going to work for most organizations. On the other hand, monitoring the landscape and making sure that you're aware when there is something like Exchange or Excellion or take your pick of VPN vulnerabilities. Pulse Secure has had various different times in the barrel. Palo, Fortinet, SonicWall right now. Those are the ones you really have to pay attention to. And the good news is the threat intel community comes together relatively quickly and understands when there's exploit code out there for that. Those are the sorts of things that really, really do matter to patch. And you end up with this interesting equilibrium where there's active exploits for these things. Then people start to patch them, patch rates get higher and higher and higher, and things shift more towards email. And then somebody finds another VPN bug and things shift back in the other direction briefly. But again, as you see in the chart there, email still does predominate. So that's how ransomware gets in. But let's actually go to a poll question. Sharon, this is one of the ones you wanted to ask. And any color you'd add as our attendees respond to this one?
Sure. I think that, Ryan, you and I talk to customers a lot, and we both talk to the media a lot. And one of the top things that people always say is, should you pay the ransom? Yes. And what kinds of companies are prepared to answer that question and have it answered already? Not many in my experience. You have to be ready to say, we've made this decision. Will we pay or will we not? And we've found too, obviously, that this has become top of mind after the situation where the Justice Department in the Biden administration was able to claw back some of that ransom. It's really becoming the answer that you need before anything else is, if we are experiencing a ransomware event, what are we willing to pay? Are we willing to pay? Who is actually at our organization authorized to deal with this situation? Right. And not be in a panic situation making those decisions.
Absolutely. I do want to answer a couple super quick questions that came in on the chat. An internet-facing appliance is something that is exactly that. It actually touches the public IPv4 internet. So a classic example of that is your VPN gateway or concentrator, if you prefer. Another example of that would be your Exchange server. If you're running it on-prem, it does need to talk to the internet in order to get mail. And file transfer servers like Excellion, which recently had a set of really nasty exploits, would be another thing, again, that touches the public internet. A web server would be in that category too, but they're much less commonly used by these attackers because they're not trying to pop your website, they're trying to get domain admin. So it looks like reasonable amount of diversity in the answers here. We had 42% say yes, 23% say no, and 35% say not sure, which basically means no. So not a shock, probably, Sherry.
It's not. And I think that for me is the number one message that I've been sending is implementing security programs take time. Doing technical assessments, it takes time. But getting in a room for an hour or two with your executives and laying out the potential scenarios and understanding what your playbook's going to be, that you can do today. And that is something that everyone needs to have in their back pocket. Of course, you keep it secret. You don't let other people know, but you've got to have that decision made. And I think over the past year and a half, the other thing we've learned is that the worst time to be making a decision about ransomware is in the middle of a pandemic when everyone's working from home. So get that decision made, get it made now.
Absolutely. So now let's get into some of the data. I'm going to give actually kind of two different views of things. This is the activity from the set of threat actors that Sheridan and her team do absolutely extraordinary work every day, except sometimes Fridays. They're lazy, right? Because they do 4-day work weeks most of the time.
There are a lot of actors that take Fridays off. It's pretty interesting how leisurely they can be sometimes.
Honestly, they're making enough money that they can probably afford to make that choice. But ultimately, you've got a set of threat actors here that might not have always played a role in the ransomware ecosystem, but now are effectively functioning as what is often called an initial access broker, meaning the first stage in the ransomware attack. That's going to happen again via what Sherrod referred to, the Swiss Army knife modular malware families, often known as downloaders, but even things that have been classically thought of as banking Trojans. Credential stealing malware is also often instrumented to look for things like RDP and VPN credentials. So it's worth paying attention to stealers as well. Those show up also relatively commonly. This is the data minus one threat actor that very famously was also associated with ransomware, Emotet, or as we call them, threat actor 542. If you put them back in the data, it actually does change what the landscape looks like. But again, you're dealing with millions and millions of messages daily, especially with Emotet back in there. Emotet, of course, went away back in Q1 of this year when most of the Emotet gang was actually arrested. That was nice to see. But as you can see, it didn't really change things meaningfully. I think a lot of the ransomware initial access brokers have been lying a little bit low since the dark side colonial thing, because that was too much heat for almost any type of criminal organization. But that is, of course, just speculation, backed up by some of the volumes changing very slightly over the last month or so. Anything to add to that, Sherrod?
No, I think that what we're seeing for sure is that these threat actor groups, they're really diversifying more than we've ever seen before. So they used to be just a gang that did banking Trojans. And then you'll see these different groups start saying, we want to make our banking Trojan a little more flexible. Oh, maybe we'll try doing a second stage payload of ransomware. Maybe we'll do info stealers. Maybe we'll steal traditional currency out of a bank account. Maybe we'll do cryptocurrency. This was before the crash over the past couple of days, but they're making smart decisions, and you can watch as they evolve their code and their hands-on keyboard operations.
Absolutely. And I think actually the other thing is relatively misunderstood about the ransomware epidemic is that it does not start right when everybody goes to work from home, right? Those volumes actually don't start spiking like crazy until afterwards. Obviously, click rates did go up as people started to work from home, but the ransomware volumes, really Q4 was the banner quarter where things started getting out of control. And then Q1 was another huge quarter for ransomware being sent by email. There are lots of questions in the chat that we'll get to in a minute, but I do want to actually hit a couple of points. And I also love the Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man meme. At this point in time, I think the type of actors that we're thinking about when we think about ransomware actors have basically the same toolkits as almost everybody else. And this is kind of an under-heralded development in the threat landscape. You might see a ransomware actor eventually use a 0-day. There have been some that seem to be really good at exploiting VPN type of appliances and are doing relatively quick turnarounds from a researcher doing work to actual exploit code. But ultimately, if you look at what they're doing, with the main botnet, meaning Emotet gone, they're doing those downloaders, which APT actors also use. They're able to develop custom malware. And in fact, ransomware as a service and the initial access brokers can both basically be considered custom malware. They're not taking off-the-shelf rats, commodity rats, and just repacking them like a bunch of the BEC actors are. And then Cobalt Strike. Literally, Cobalt Strike is absolutely everywhere. And Cobalt Strike beacons, I think, you'd make a lot of APT and ransomware actors cry if you took the Cobalt Strike beacons away. On the other hand, you've also got things that are useful to every type of actor. And this is where I think things get truly interesting. Spoofing of identities, that continues to be incredibly useful because the social engineering component here remains an incredibly key part of things. Compromised Office 365 accounts. Emotet was the king of thread hijacking, but compromised Office 365, Google, SendGrid, really trusted cloud infrastructure really, really does make the threat landscape go around for everybody, very much including ransomware actors. And then, of course, if you've got a remote access Trojan or a rat, you can kind of do anything. So those are indispensable to, frankly, all types of actors. And as I mentioned before, stealers are used widely by both ransomware actors and BEC actors. So it's not like the tooling defines the threat actor these days so much as the monetization strategy, which of course has evolved fairly slightly. And now that we're joined by Spider-Man, we can actually also look at kind of the technical side of this, right? Again, with 0 days staying on the APT side of things, the ransomware actors are very much acting like a red team. They're going in and they're trying to get domain admin. They're doing privilege escalation, they're moving laterally, and they're living off the land binaries. This is, I know, getting a little bit technical, so I'm not going to bore too many people with it, but phishing macros, though, that really does make things go round. And we've got a fantastic example of a campaign that, Sherrod, I would love if you could take us through, because I think you're sort of like the ransomware sommelier, and this is a fine, only very slightly aged example from February.
So the thing that we like to mention when we talk about social engineering for a lot of these lures is that we see these threat actors, one, do things that aren't particularly sophisticated in their lures, but two, they love a cake, layer after layer after layer. So as you can see here, this is an order confirmation or an invoice. Social engineering has been around for decades. It's tried and true. But on this one, we spread a thin layer of COVID on top of it. And this is a lure that in the past would just have been invoice. But now you can add that COVID pandemic panic to it and get people more likely to click. So of course, this is a PDF with URL inside the PDF. And this could be any kind of attachment. And this is one that we wrote about in our blog, a flower delivery service. So if you go to the next slide, it's a pretty difficult attack chain here. So you get your invoice attachments. This is what the PDF looks like. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. This actually doesn't have a link in it. You are actually required to go to this flowersny.net URL and then put your order number in from the fake invoice that they sent you.
Yeah, so no hyperlink. You have to copy and paste that URL, which is not really looking like a URL in the document for any automated tool to potentially find. You have to go type in flowersny.net into a browser.
And this, by this point, this person is extremely confused. And I also want to note the date here. Early February, as you said, Valentine's Day. So it almost sort of makes sense that, well, flowers, Valentine's Day.
There's only two things that don't make sense. First off, you're not going to get 15 Carolina roses in New York City for $23.
For $23.
Also, sales tax is a little low. But apart from that, yeah, just spot on.
So you type in your invoice number here, and that is when it asks you to download, I believe, a malicious macro Excel document that has the, that you go here and you download this and it's asking you to DocuSign. We have seen quite a bit of these kinds of macros that have enable editing, enable content as a classic, but we've seen quite a bit of these macros that just, again, smear on Microsoft, McAfee, Symantec, RSA. Look, this thing is secure.
Yeah, exactly. They're hilariously using the RSA security analytics logo, which is what happens when you do a Google image search for RSA. RSA Security Analytics is what NetWitness is called. It's a packet analysis tool that Gartner might call a network traffic analysis tool, and ultimately is not what the brand they're going for. But you can see the effort that they put in here and just how hard it is to get through this infection chain. But at the end of all of this work, building a website with Squarespace or something, actually doing custom invoice numbers for every single recipient, and effectively password protecting their payload on a website that had no link to the original campaign. At the end of that, oh, what is it? It's a macro. And that is, again, the thing that is absolutely on fire right now. There are things like protected view. There are ways to try and use GPO settings to try and protect against macros. Threat actors are incredibly good at getting around that. And so it is incredibly important that you not only catch as many of these as possible and don't deliver those emails, but secondly, teach your users to recognize things like this. Normal flower shops do not put that in an Excel document. It's just social engineering, and that enable macros thing has never been more important for every single person in an organization to be aware of, whether or not they know what macros are or do, because a huge percentage of the landscape relies on it.
Absolutely. Malicious macros are the bread and butter. Those are really foundational to distributing malware. And Ryan, as you know, we've seen more and more of this really convoluted attack chain than ever before. Threat actors are creating elaborate websites. We did one about a fake streaming site where they put up fake movies that you could download because they wanted you to call and cancel your membership. This one where they want you to paste all of these invoice numbers in before you finally get the payload. It's worth it to them. Because
Absolutely.
if they can get $1 million or a couple of $1 million,
15 million, yeah.
It's worth it.
So let's talk about that payday and kind of the attack flow here. We've got a bunch of questions in chat that we'll get to before the end of this webinar, but Sharon, I think this is the other thing that has not necessarily been well understood about how all of these pieces work together in the crimeware ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I know you work a ton on threat actor psychology, and I love all of the research that you've done on things like that. But the thing to really remember here is when we talk about ransomware, that threat actor might not only do ransomware. They might be making choices about what that final payload or what that final attack chain is going to be. And the other thing that they're making choices about is once they have deployed that ransomware, what are they going to do next? Are they going to, or previously, if they have downloaded a bunch of files, are they going to let the victim know, hey, I've downloaded copies of a lot of sensitive information. I'm either going to sell it privately or I'm going to release it publicly and shame you every day until you pay me. Then we've got negotiation on both sides. So these threat actors have negotiators. Victims have the option of using private for pay negotiators that specialize in this. And it's created almost this cottage industry of multiple sales, multiple extortion vectors. And then how do you deal with that? You sometimes have to hire a professional negotiator to get it done.
Yeah. And it really is led to a bunch of interesting, both technical techniques, as well as just a frankly bizarre ecosystem popping up where people know that REvil negotiates a certain way and will not respond to emotional pleas from a ransomware hospital that people will actually die. They do not care. Others will actually move on their initial position, and data has been gathered on how much they will move. And actually, as someone I think pointed out in the chat, there are also the issue of OFAC sanctions. We have Aqua, Maxim Yakubetsky, who has been involved in a variety of different evolving ransomware crews in the Evil Corp ecosystem, who is obviously sanctioned by the Department of Justice. And at least at this point in time, the Biden administration just wants you to let them know, or let the DOJ know through appropriate channels, that you are in negotiation with a ransomware actor. There hasn't been any official prohibition on paying, but it has led to a really weird situation. One of the details that I think is fairly interesting to notice here is that stealing all that data is also not easy. It's not new, but it does require some work on the part of the threat actor. And to some extent, this goes back to the glory days of the data breach, where it was about hoovering up gigabytes or terabytes of information and figuring out how to actually get it out of the environment. It's worth briefly mentioning what seems to happen most often there. So you have an actor who's got several different legitimate accounts to work with. So they're basically either on fully compromised machines using legitimate creds, and actually finding one that will serve as an appropriate staging server. From there, once they've located the data of interest, which they are often led to via things like public financial filings and their own understanding of the target company's business, they then actually do a really interesting trick to get around classic network DLP. They take a file or many files and put it in a zip. And sometimes they're just using a portable executable. There's lots of different ways to do this, even with like a tool like WinRAR or 7-zip, which again, if you're finding those on a machine that's not supposed to have them, that is something to ring some alarm bells around. But they put a zip inside a zip inside a zip inside a zip, sometimes 4 or 5 layers deep, which is really clever, because even if you're looking at that traffic on the wire, and even if you're managing to effectively decrypt it, strip TLS, all you're going to find is another zip file. It's the Russian nesting doll of exfil techniques, pun entirely intended. And that actually has become really key to their negotiating strategy, because those files held to ransom and threatened to be leaked publicly have become effectively par for the course for all types of ransomware actors in terms of what their own monetization strategy looks like and how much leverage they have over a potential victim.
Absolutely. And I think that DLP obviously is a big part of the strategy for detecting that and maybe heading off something worse. I think too, kind of that middle box is what I'm watching from an emerging threats perspective, which is how does the social side of this play in? You know, with Colonial Pipe, we saw DarkSide say, oh, we didn't know that this would disrupt the social fabric. That was not our intention. Whether that's true or not, I think they learned that it was a bit of a PR disaster to shut down the gas pipelines in the United States. And then things like the police departments that have been ransomed, we've seen those threat actor groups release psychological assessments on officers as sort of a hacktivism, social aspect of, we think kind of the public won't be up in arms about this in the same way they would as if we ransomed a hospital. So they're starting to become a hacktivism angle to the decision-making around the victims, the targeting, and potentially the data that's released.
Exactly. And of course, these techniques can be used to disrupt a business if you want to disrupt the business, and ransomware is a convenient cover story for that. So that is my nightmare scenario, but let's not talk about it because we have a ton of good questions to get into. So Bob asks, when you add two-factor auth, is the RDP threat brought way down? The answer is simply yes, overall. RDP, though, at least in my experience, is one of the harder things to MFA. So really the right answer is that's not what you should be exposing to the public internet, even if you do manage to MFA it. In general, you want to use remote desktop protocol only internally and in really, really careful, judicious ways. It's just so prone to abuse. A couple other questions. Millions of IoT devices directly connected to the internet, are they threats? Not really, mostly because it's much more profitable right now to go in and get domain admin and go after a single organization. If you think about the millions of IoT devices, charging a ransom to millions of different people is going to be really hard. Like, how do you get paid on all of that? And actually, Sharon, this is a throwback to the 2016 days of ransomware, where they would spray and pray email and ransom individual machines.
Right, it is. And I think that, with IoT, the ransomware side of that is people buy televisions for Christmas and they're ransomed, they can't use them. A lot of the software development for hardware and firmware, they've gotten much more resilient than they were. They used to just throw some like Windows type operating system on and just let it go. But those developers have gotten a lot more aware of hardening things since those events. But I mean, IoT devices, they're just somebody's computer, and
right.
They have vulnerabilities too.
NAT is, again, saving the world because you're usually behind, a cable modem that is doing that. And actually, that's a useful segue to Des's question. Is a user's desktop behind a firewall considered internet facing using NAT without an associated public IP other than the firewall's outside interface? That is not considered internet facing for sure. At the same time, though, there's not really too many full-blown remote code exec vulnerabilities for Windows or Mac. So we're seeing way, way, way more of them on things like VPN devices anyway. So both of those are contributing to desktops really getting owned through things like macros, as we showed in the example. Kevin asks, is removing Windows admin access enough to halt email ransomware attacks? Sadly, no. There are privilege escalation techniques that are genuinely tough to find. Dumping creds moving laterally is something that you can do. And also, we are now actually seeing the first set of ransomware incidents that start with Office 365 compromised accounts that lead to escalation of privilege in the on-prem environment. There was a very prominent example of that about 2 weeks ago that I'm not at liberty to go into detail on. So Windows admin access, unfortunately, has nothing to do with that. Sure, yeah, you absolutely want to get rid of local admin wherever you can for a whole host of reasons, but it's not enough, unfortunately. Gary asked, what's Cobalt Strike? Cobalt Strike is a red teaming tool that is made by a legitimate cybersecurity vendor that has unfortunately gotten out and is basically, if you know Metasploit, it really can do everything you need to do in terms of especially a post-exploitation framework for once you have that point of presence, what do you do with it? How do you establish persistence? How do you move around laterally? Cobalt Strike helps you do all of that without much of a learning curve. Is maybe what I would. call it.
Yeah, it's almost point and click, and it's not too hard to purchase, and it's relatively affordable, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Especially for somebody doing ransomware. I have one question I wanted to answer really quick. Do you think outside the Colonial Pipeline event causing a slowdown in ransomware attacks, could the recent crypto crash have an impact as large on parts of the financial and attack support structures tied to crypto? I absolutely believe that. I've been tracking cryptocurrency in the crimeware landscape for years and years, and they align themselves to where they can make that money. Current cryptocurrency crashing is a potential pressurizing factor for some of these ransomware actors. They might go back to things like banking Trojans. They might start looking at only doing initial access and selling that. I think it will have an impact if it continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have time for one last question, because I know this was a really tight time frame for this webinar today. Travis asks, what's your suggestion for isolating the work from home systems when you don't have a centralized presence to route traffic through? Great question. There are new modern solutions that replace VPNs. They are, I'm going to use the Gartner term, zero trust network access solutions. They're all software based. You can think of them as software defined networking. You can basically put an agent on that device and make sure you have control. And you can even isolate traffic if you want to. There's really some very clever ways to do this. All of it lives in the cloud, does not require backhauling traffic, tromboning traffic, or any of the really unpleasant things we did in years past. One of those many solutions is called Proofpoint Meta, which you might want to check out. Just closing it down, a lot of people have asked for the recording and the slides. Those will absolutely be available. And Sharon, your team did an absolutely fantastic blog on what all this looks like in detail. Any quick closing comments on that?
Please take a look at that blog. It's an excellent primer, and it gives our point of view on the actors that we see being part of that ransomware ecosystem, what we think they've done, what we think they're going to do. It's a really good piece of information to check out.
Absolutely. It has my first personal favorite, the mapping between the email threat actor, the malware family, and the related ransomware as a service operator. Obviously, we do a ton of things at Proofpoint to stop all this every day. We're not going to bore you with the details, but ultimately, again, close that RDP down, please, please, please. Patch your VPNs and then focus on email. You'll be in a much better place when it comes to ransomware. And as Sharon kind of not so subtly hinted with the polling question, please have a plan. That's it for our time today. Thank you all so much for joining, and we will talk to you all soon.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay, so hopefully you found that video very helpful. Although really Ryan and Sharon only scratched the surface of ransomware. And if you really want to learn more about these attacks, we're hosting a live Q&A session with Ryan and Sharon on Friday, July 9th. So next Friday, July 9th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, 2:30 p.m. Eastern. So please look for that on our LinkedIn page here on Proofpoint and on our website, proofpoint.com, and we hope to see you there.